esta vez tenemos el placer, el agrado y el honor de tener a un gran amigo, no solamente de la universidad, sino también de las ideas de la libertad, que es Niall Ferguson. Es casi milagroso que en su agenda haya encontrado un tiempo para venir a Chile. Llega hoy, se va pasado mañana, y para nosotros, por cierto, es un privilegio tenerlo. Para que ustedes se hagan una idea de la persona que nos visita hoy y que, como bien mencionó Ignacio, es miembro académico honorario de esta universidad y por lo tanto está en su casa. Niall Ferguson no solamente es uno de los historiadores más importantes del mundo, Time suele decir que es el historiador británico más brillante de su generación, podríamos dejarlo en el historiador más brillante, punto. Profesor de Harvard por más de una década, ha estado en las instituciones más importantes del mundo, ahora está en Stanford, en la Hoover, como decía bien Ignacio. Es el autor de más de 14 libros. El último salió recién publicado este año, The Square and the Tower. Es un análisis muy profundo, muy interesante sobre los networks y las jerarquías y cómo estos interactúan, a veces entran en conflicto y lo que significa para el mundo que viene. Pero además es muy importante destacar en Niall la influencia que tiene. Una de las cosas que llama la atención es lo bien conectado que está en el mundo. Es decir, Niall es una de esas personas que parecen no tener límites al acceso a quién pueden llegar. Y eso es una cosa impresionante. Que además se refleja en el análisis que él hace en su libro, porque él parte diciendo en su último libro que si bien él no es una persona con autoridad y con poder en un sentido formal, que hasta su hijo de 5 años encuentra formas de desafiar su poder, sí pertenece a networks y forma parte de networks que son muy relevantes. Y por lo tanto, creo yo que a fin de cuentas tiene más poder de lo que muchos podemos imaginarnos. Ha sido elegido una de las 100 personas más influyentes del mundo por Time Magazine, para que nos hagamos una idea. Es columnista habitual del Sunday Times, del Boston Globe. Es cofundador y Managing Director de Green Mantle, que es una empresa que hace, ¿no es cierto?, asesorías, digamos, a empresarios de distintas partes del mundo, y cuyo socio fundador también está acompañándonos hoy, que es Pier Paolo, que lo acompaña, así que muy bienvenido Pier Paolo. Todo un intelectual con sus méritos propios también, que vamos a tener algún día también acompañándonos aquí. Y por último quisiera destacar tal vez lo más importante de todo, y que para Niall ciertamente es lo más importante, y es que es padre de 5 hijos. Y el último acaba de nacer hace un par de días atrás. Entonces, el pobre viene con un jet lag espantoso y además no ha podido dormir porque está con un bebé de un par de días en su casa, y le pedimos nosotros este tremendo sacrificio de cruzar, ¿no es cierto?, esa distancia gigantesca que es desde la costa de California hasta Chile para acompañarnos. Así que, por favor, démosle un fuerte aplauso y caluroso a Niall Ferguson por estar aquí. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Axel. Forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, if I address you in English. My 5-year-old son speaks better Spanish than I do, and I don't want to embarrass myself. Thank you also, Ignacio. It's a pleasure to be back here, as you say, back home at this great institution. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the work that Axel does at the Foundation for Progress, as well as the work that he does here as a professor, and the contribution that's being made by the Adolfo Ibáñez University to Chile's public life. I've been asked to talk to you this afternoon about free speech and the threats to it. Normally, when someone like me flies in, whether it's from Stanford or Harvard or, for that matter, Oxford or Cambridge, they talk about their life. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about my wife. because nobody that I have ever met has a better understanding of free speech as a concept than Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan was born a girl in a Muslim world, in Somalia. She grew up without the freedoms that we in this room take for granted. She grew up knowing that as a girl, she was a second-class citizen, and that there was a large range of subjects about which she should not speak, questions she should not answer. And when she raised questions that her grandmother or her mother did not like her to raise, they would hit her. It was a long and winding road that led my wife from Somalia by way of Saudi Arabia and Kenya to the Netherlands, where she sought asylum, mainly in order to escape an arranged marriage that her father had set up for her. In the Netherlands, Ayaan encountered for the first time at the University of Leiden some of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment and of the 19th and 20th centuries, including Hayek, but also the great 18th century thinkers, David Hume, Adam Smith. When she encountered for the first time the notion of individual freedom, the idea of the equality of the sexes, the possibility of critical thinking about everything, yes, even about religion, she was enraptured. Some of you have had a tiring day, and it's tempting in a lecture hall to nod off, like the gentleman in the green shirt. But the reason that you are succumbing to that temptation is that you take freedom for granted. Nobody ever hit you, struck you in the face for questioning, for example, the sanctity of the words of the Prophet Muhammad. But my wife dared to be free. She dared to suggest, as a young politician, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, still the single greatest act of mass slaughter in modern American history, that there might be a connection between the terrorism being perpetrated by groups like Al-Qaeda and Islam itself. And for making that connection, for raising that question, my wife found herself threatened not just with blows to the head, but with death threats. In 2004, her friend Theo van Gogh, with whom she was collaborating to make a film about the relationship between Islam and women's rights, was murdered, shot and stabbed to death in the streets of Amsterdam as he rode home on his bicycle. And his murderer, an Islamic extremist, pinned a note to his body, and on that note, he said that Ayaan would be next. From then on, Ayaan had to live with recurrent threats to her life. She learned that free speech is not, after all, free, and that the protections that had been promised to her by those who encouraged her in her political career in the Netherlands were not unconditional and were not permanent. Today, the cost of free speech, if you're interested, the cost, in other words, of the security that you have to pay for to ensure that you do not suffer the fate of Stéphane Charbonnier, editor of Charlie Hebdo, is around $1 million a year. That's what free speech turns out to cost. I tell you all this because it's so different from my own story. I grew up in Glasgow, where free speech is a compulsion, where insult is the normal currency of everyday exchange, a city where jokes about religion were second only to jokes about football in our daily lives. I grew up free. I grew up accustomed to bitter arguments around the family dinner table. These most commonly occurred around Christmas, when my communist great-uncle Alfred, who went his holidays to the Soviet Union because he preferred it to the West, would draw verbal swords and duel with my grandfather, a passionate liberal who understood far better than great-uncle Alfred the realities of life under Soviet communism, though he'd never been to the shores of the Black Sea himself. When I was a teenager, punk rock arrived on the scene, closely followed by Margaret Thatcher. I've often described my young self as a punk Tory, because there seemed an obvious connection between Johnny Rotten's challenge to the musical establishment of the United Kingdom and Margaret Thatcher's challenge to the political and economic establishment. I can still remember the excitement of hearing the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen when it was released in 1977 and immediately banned by the BBC. The fact of its being banned made it all the more enjoyable to listen to. As a student at Oxford, I dabbled, as students do, in student journalism. And I wrote so many offensive articles on such a wide range of subjects that I look back on them with a shudder, imagining what will happen when eventually WikiLeaks releases them all on the internet. But in those days, the early 1980s, you could say pretty much anything in the United Kingdom, and not a great deal could happen to you, except one thing. You would receive, if you published an incendiary article, letters, usually 3 or 4 letters, written in green ink by ferocious readers taking issue with your right to your views. The green ink letter writers held no terror for me. I just assumed, as I went through the early phase of my academic career, that I could say what I liked. The only standard to which I held myself was that it must be true. In my historical research, in my early years, I frequently took issue with other scholars and sought to show that they were wrong on points of interpretation or of fact. I did not ask myself the question, are my conclusions congenial? Will they make me popular? The only question I asked myself was, is it right? It only dawned on me gradually, after I moved to the United States, that life wasn't quite so simple. It only gradually became apparent to me that the writers of letters in green ink had acquired a new power, thanks above all to the advent of the internet. You see, the people who wrote letters in green ink acquired in the form of Twitter or their blogs a new power that they hadn't had before. The power to denounce, not in the mail, but on the internet. And when I first experienced online denunciation for something that I'd written, it came as a shock. Instead of a few letters in green ink, suddenly I was on the receiving end of thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of hostile denunciations online. I had tenure at Harvard by that time. That did not stop a historian, or rather an economist at Berkeley, from calling on more than one occasion for me to be fired by Harvard for something that I had written. Another economist, then at Princeton, also published regularly in the New York Times, thought nothing of repeatedly hurling insults and abuse at me and calling into question not only my intellectual good faith, but my morals. Casual accusations of bigotry became a routine part of public life in the United States over the last 10 or so years. Arguments about economics were very quickly sidetracked into investigations of the good faith, the prejudices or lack of prejudices of their authors. As I said, it came as a shock, but it shouldn't have. I had failed to learn from history. What is the lesson of history on the subject of free speech? The lesson is that it is the exception and not the rule. For most of history, most people have not enjoyed free speech. Most human beings have lived in a condition much closer to that of my wife than the extraordinary liberty that I enjoyed as a young man. It was routine throughout most of history for heretics to be put to death, for those who expressed political criticism to be executed or at least mutilated, for books uncongenial to ruling elites to be burned, for dissidents to be incarcerated. When you think about it, over a 2,000-year time horizon, you realize with a start how unusual free speech is, and how remarkable our era of relative free speech was, and I use the word was advisedly. The first real challenges to the tradition of unfree speech came in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. One might say the first really successful exercise of free speech was Martin Luther's exactly 500 years ago, when he launched the Reformation with a challenge to the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church that in previous centuries would simply have led to his being burnt at the stake as a heretic. Why was Luther successful where previous critics of the papacy had failed? The answer lies in the realm of technology. It was the fact that the printing press existed that allowed Luther's message to go viral, as we would now say, to spread across Europe. In multiple editions of his sermons and other writings, Luther's ideas spread in ways that had not been possible when the only mode of reproduction of the written word was the careful hand copying of a literate elite. The printing press was not controlled by anyone. It was, in our own terms, a distributed technology. Johannes Gutenberg did not own all the printing presses in Germany. And that was why, ultimately, the Reformation network could defeat the Roman Catholic hierarchy in at least half of Europe. When you think about it, and I urge you to think about it rather than chat to your neighbor, when you think about it, yes, I'm talking about you two. Yes, you two. When you think about it, everything you study here can be traced back to a succession of intellectual revolutions beginning 500 years ago that spread despite the opposition of authority. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the revolutionary ideas that produced the American and then French republics, the Industrial Revolution. These revolutions spread because nobody could control the printing presses and nobody could control the networks of correspondence which united intellectuals all around the world. And yet, the great era of free speech that produced Voltaire and his great observation that he might disagree with you, but he would defend to the death your right to say something he disagreed with, that era ended. And the world reverted during the 19th and 20th centuries to a time of hierarchical dominance and generalized censorship. The world of our grandparents was not a world of free speech. The mid-20th century, in most countries, was a time of really quite rigorous censorship. Most rigorous in the totalitarian states, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, but also surprisingly extensive even in those societies that insisted they were free. Why was that? Again, it was because of technology. The technologies of the 19th and 20th century, the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, the cinema, the television, lent themselves much more than the printing press and the letter to centralized control. And by the middle of the 20th century, it was possible for Joseph Stalin to control the speech of every Soviet citizen through a network of censorship and surveillance that essentially killed the possibility of freedom itself. We should be thankful that the totalitarian project of the mid-20th century ultimately failed. Failed for reasons that Hayek, after whom your chair is named, Axel, so well understood. The centralizing authority cannot optimally allocate resources, and in the absence of freedom, there cannot be innovation. It was not accidental that the internet was invented in the United States and not in the Soviet Union. Oh, the Soviets had a project to create their own computer network. It was, in fact, established as a project in Kiev, the capital of what is now independent Ukraine. But the Soviet internet, or internet, as it should perhaps be called, failed because central control prevented the rapid proliferation of distributed and independent nodes, as the Department of Defense allowed to happen in the United States. I now understand, as I didn't before, I grew up in a new age of technologically driven freedom. After Watergate, the press broke free of the constraints that had been imposed on it in the Western world in the mid-20th century. Meanwhile, in the Soviet system, centralized control broke down completely to the point that the system itself collapsed, and with it the Soviet Union too. The internet in its early phase, in the 1980s and 1990s, held out the promise of libertarian nirvana. We were going to be able to say whatever we liked in cyberspace to whomever we liked. John Barlow's manifesto proclaiming the independence of cyberspace is almost comical to read now, but at the time, in the 1990s, it seemed plausible. The independent realm of cyberspace would achieve the ultimate in human freedom. Universal connectivity, free communication for all of humanity. And yet, even as that nirvana glimmered within reach, a cold wind was blowing, and it was blowing above all on university campuses. This was not a wind from above. It was not the state that mandated political correctness in classrooms and on campuses. On the contrary, this movement emanated from faculty and was supported by at least some students. Even as we have fantasized about an age of free speech online, in reality, in many universities in the Western world, free speech has been in retreat since the 1980s. And the most recent developments that I behold on university campuses give me real and grave concern. Hate speech. Hate speech is the 21st century term for heresy. And if you are accused of hate speech as a professor on most American campuses today, you'd better look out. Because the process of no platforming, of online harassment, will begin the minute they suspect you of being a political heretic. It is a strange combination of the Puritanism of early 17th century New England and the excesses of the Cultural Revolution in Mao's China. It's also, for some, a kind of career. Witchfinder was a kind of career in many parts of Europe and even Massachusetts in the 17th century. The witchfinders of our time seek political witches, heretics, online, and the trials occur on Twitter and Facebook. This is a deeply disturbing trend. And what's most disturbing about it? is that it seems to spread outwards from the United States to British universities, to European universities, and who knows, perhaps also to South American universities. Beware. Beware the witch-finders. Beware the new denouncers of heresy. They pose a profound threat, not just to free speech, but to free thought. I don't know if you've ever tried thinking without speaking. It's a lot less satisfying, and it really limits your impact on other people. I find myself thinking more and speaking less. It has a chilling kind of effect to be accused of racism or homophobia, to have yourself called a white supremacist in the London Review of Books. It makes you a little uneasy when such accusations get repeated and repeated, when they make an annual appearance every time your enemies amongst the witch-finders decide to have a go at you. No, I'm not going to stop saying the things that I have said that are politically incorrect. I still believe that on balance, the benefits of the British Empire exceeded the costs. That is hate speech in the eyes of a generation of post-colonial scholars, but it seems to me to be empirically verifiable economic history. Yes, there are things that John Maynard Keynes said that were wrong. Yes, there were things that President Barack Obama did that were wrong. And even worse, yes, there are some things that President Donald Trump has done that are right. I continue to publish such heretical views, but I do it each week with a heavier heart, with a feeling of dread, wondering, will the witch-finders come after me this week? Will I have to increase the security budget for me and my family this month? When the atmosphere becomes as toxic as it has become in some parts of this country, of the United States, I should say, when scholars like Charles Murray face physical assault when they give speeches as invited guests at, for example, Middlebury College, something very unpleasant is happening. And the most unpleasant thing about it, ladies and gentlemen, is the response that I myself feel. The response to self-censor. The response to play safe. The temptation to retreat into private life, into the safety of one's own study. Yes, it turns out that internal exile is possible also in the West, though we used to think it was something that only happened to intellectuals in communist countries. Let me conclude by asking what we can do to turn this toxic tide. Well, we as academics and students can uphold a culture of tolerance and civility in an atmosphere of open exchanges of views. Could you wake that guy up? Just give him a nudge. Hey, free speech isn't free. What can we do? Take the earphone out. What can we do? We need, it seems to me, somehow, to make a collective effort to restore civility, but also openness to our intellectual life. We need to defend the right of free speech, except when it is used to attack free speech. It was Karl Popper who said we should tolerate everything except intolerance. I constantly come back to those words as I contemplate our present situation. Not everything can be said. You wouldn't want every detail of your personal life to be on the internet, unless you'd already posted it there yourself deliberately. We wouldn't want every detail of our lives to be online in a kind of ultimately transparent world. We don't want pedophilia, and we don't want terrorist propaganda. There are some limits to what can be allowed. Nobody can be a complete free speech absolutist. But I favor the thinnest of censorship and the thickest of skins. Just because you're offended, and you may have been offended by my waking you up, doesn't mean I'm going to shut up. When people say to me, I'm offended, my attitude is, diddums. I don't know how that translates into Spanish. And yet I hear this argument all the time. Oh, I'm so offended by what you say. That is verbal violence. No, it's not. There's violence and there's words. It's different. I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Glasgow, where insult is the common currency of dialogue. We were taught sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. What happened to that? When did we become so hypersensitive that we couldn't take a joke? I began with Martin Luther. I'll end with him. It's a little risky in a predominantly Catholic country, but bear with me. Martin Luther was asked early in the Reformation by the good citizens of Worms, should we allow a translation of the Quran into German? Surely not. Surely we should not allow this book to be published in German. Luther replied, of course we should. Nothing will expose the errors of that book more surely than its publication. That seems to me the essence of the Western spirit of critical thought. My wife has often talked to me about a book she would like to write. It's a book set in the New York Public Library. And she imagines strange meetings occurring in that library between the Prophet Muhammad and Hayek and Popper, amongst others. I hope one day that she does write this book, because it's the kind of book the world needs. But I know that when she does write it, and when it is published, that security budget will have to go up once again. Because, as I mentioned to our sleepy friend, free speech turns out not to be free at all. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Neil, very much for that fantastic presentation. Yo quisiera abrir para que ustedes le hagan preguntas a Niall y aprovechar. La última vez que estuvo en Chile fue hace 5 años. Esperemos que no pase tanto tiempo, pero no es fácil tener a uno de los intelectuales más influyentes y más potentes que existen hoy día en el mundo conversando con nosotros. Antes quisiera hacerles una pregunta a ustedes, a los alumnos acá, al público en general. ¿Cuántos de ustedes creen que nadie tiene el derecho de ofender a otra persona con lo que diga? Que no debiera estar, digamos, no es que no debiera estar permitido, pero que uno no puede hablar cosas ofensivas para determinados grupos. ¿Nadie cree eso? O sea,
I was very persuasive.
you were very persuasive. So your talk basically closed the issue at this university, at least. But I will start. Yo voy a tomar la primera pregunta y los que quieran preguntar, por favor, vayan levantando su mano, así vamos avanzando con eso. No sé si hay un micrófono, creo que alguien tiene un micrófono, perfecto. Voy a hacer la primera pregunta, entonces vamos a tomar la libertad ya que estamos aquí. Let's go back to hate speech, because there is a debate among scholars even if that is covered or not by the American Constitution. Hate speech. What should we understand by hate speech, and why is it covered by free speech under the Constitution or any free society framework, basically?
Well, the First Amendment of the US Constitution is pretty explicit that Congress cannot limit speech, or for that matter, the freedom of worship. The courts have been called on repeatedly to rule on this issue. So there's a substantial body of US law, as some of you may know, that establishes what is not allowed. There were times, most obviously in time of war, when the First Amendment rights of citizens were significantly limited, too much. In the McCarthy era, in the period of maximum anxiety about Soviet or communist infiltration of the US system, there were many violations of people's constitutional rights. But subsequently, the courts pushed back those infringements and established a pretty clear rule. You cannot use the right of free speech to incite acts of violence. If hate speech is to have any meaning, and I don't like the term, it must be that free speech cannot be used to call for the death of an individual or group. And when, for example, my wife is threatened online, which happens all too often, and an explicit death threat is made, I have no hesitation in notifying the FBI. So I think that's the rule. I think the courts have been very consistent on this issue for many years. The problem is the argument made by so-called progressives, who are anything but progressive, on campuses, that that's not sufficient. And there needs to be a broader definition of hate speech, which essentially includes anything that anybody finds upsetting. Right. And that use of the term seems to me extraordinarily harmful, not least at institutions that are supposed to be all about free inquiry.
Vamos entonces a partir con la primera pregunta.
Good afternoon, Professor Ferguson. My name is Jose Augusto. I would like to ask you a question. As a historian, I'm a pretty pessimist as well, and looking backwards is always something difficult regarding human nature. And I would like to ask you how important and how useful is to defend free speech nowadays, when it seems that we don't have much censorship but more a death debate. Because in the social media, people are much often not hear each other. So the debate is pretty a death debate. And we did this social media bubbles, ideological bubbles, that no one talks to no one, or you talk only with your own partisans. So how useful, as a pretty pessimistic historian, how useful and how important is to defend free speech in this era of death debate, much worse than censorship?
This is a great question, and one that I've been thinking a lot about. The new book, which Axel mentioned, The Square and the Tower, includes an extended reflection on the phenomenon of polarization that you've just alluded to. You're probably aware of this from your own experience, because I know a lot of people here are on Facebook. But the way in which social media work is, as you've just said, to steer people, to direct people into echo chambers, into capsules or bubbles, where they essentially
read-only things that the algorithm thinks they will like. That's how it works. Because Facebook's incentivized to get you to stick to content, to engage with content, it wants to steer you towards things it thinks you will like. And the effect, which I think was unintended, though it was predictable, has been to create clusters that are roughly ideological. In the United States, you see a liberal cluster and you see a conservative cluster. It's even more obvious on Twitter. There's a great study I read this year which shows that if you want to get retweeted, I don't know how many people here. How many people here actually use Twitter, just out of interest? Okay. So a substantial proportion of you. So if you're interested in retweets, which some people care about, then people only retweet stuff they agree with, broadly speaking. There's very little retweeting of things that you disagree with. And you are 20 to 30% more likely to be retweeted if you use emotive language. Which is why whenever people are being negative about me online, they use a lot of swear words. For some reason, the left does this much more than the right. So you know it's the left wing on Twitter where you're called an effing fascist. People instinctively know that calling me an effing fascist is more likely to get retweeted than just a fascist. So I think you've identified one of the central problems of the modern public sphere, that it is breaking down into two public spheres that don't communicate with each other. And some of the diagrams, when you graph the networks, are really terrifying. This was predictable because social networks tend to work that way, even small ones without technology. We know from many social studies there tends to be some kind of polarization in any group of human beings, along ideological or racial or some other fault line. So when those people who created Facebook and Twitter say today, oh, we're so shocked. We thought we were creating a global community, but this is terrible. We're so surprised. My response is, well, duh. I mean, you're surprised that human beings could use Facebook for bad purposes? I mean, of course, if you drop out of Harvard without taking any history courses, that's the kind of thing you're liable to think. But those of us who study history know that human beings, if you connect them all together, don't just share cute cat videos. That is not the way the human being works. So, yeah, you're dead right. There's a problem. And I think we're not going to fix it if we leave things as they are. The current setup in which 45% of Americans get their news from the Facebook news feed, which is entirely without any liabilities of the sort that publishers have to contend with, that is a guaranteed recipe for continued polarization of public life and a kind of breakdown in communication between left and right. We need to change that. Of course, it's difficult to do. I'll give you an example of why it's difficult. There's a TV personality, presenter, named Van Jones on CNN, who's a Democrat. He's African American. If you ever see CNN in the US, you'll very likely see Van talking about the news. He used to do a TV show with Newt Gingrich. And they attempted in this show to show that the left and the right could have a conversation. And the show had 3 segments. And for 3 out of the 4 segments, they would disagree. They would go at one another, hammer and tongs. If it was gun control, if it was abortion, they would just go at one another. But in the 4th of the segments, in the last segment, they would find an issue they agreed on. Sounds great, doesn't it? Except for one thing. Here are the ratings. Segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, segment 4. people stopped watching the minute those guys started to agree. So we have an appetite for this kind of polarized debate. And unfortunately, social media cater to that appetite.
Por ahí atrás hay otra pregunta.
Good evening, I'm Victor Hugo. First of all, I'm very glad and proud to be here right now. I would like to ask you how we can deal with the victimization present in our society, especially in my generation. Because
Correctness.
in politics, well,
Sí, sí.
no, porque políticamente hablando, la victimización presente en nuestra sociedad, especialmente en el segmento más joven, es el arma principal de la izquierda, y eso es preocupante, porque la gente suele actuar primero con los sentimientos, y en las redes sociales, Instagram, Facebook, se piensa todo primero con lo ofensivo y lo sentimental, antes de racionalizar las cosas. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos nosotros combatir eso? ¿Cómo podemos combatir esa intolerancia a los hechos y a los argumentos? Porque yo, como estudiante de media, veo a diario que mi compañero antepone los sentimientos ante los hechos. Y uno, cuando explica las cosas como son, suele ser tildado de racista, de fascista, que mente cuadrada y que prácticamente no tiene tolerancia, cuando los intolerantes son...
Yeah, it's to me deeply depressing that being a student has got so much tougher than it was. It really has. In the early 1980s at Oxford, I was part of a small minority of pro-Thatcher, anti-communist students, and we had great fun making mock of the left-wing majority. We had the time of our lives. They must have hated us, but they really couldn't get back at us. Because imagine, it was the early 1980s. There was no internet. Never mind Facebook and Twitter. We used to write letters to one another on paper. I'll show you the devices we used. These are called pens. And so it got to the point where there was this extreme communist whose name was Kong. And we made fun of his positions, and he would write very hostile things about us in the Magdalen College Library Suggestions book. That was how little power he had. Today you have to contend with Facebook, Twitter, etc. And I see students at Harvard, I've seen it in the past, intimidated into silence for fear that they will face these accusations, where if you say something that is somewhat to the right of center, you're a fascist. If you criticize President Obama, you must be a racist. If you say something in Edward Keynes, you must be homophobic. And it makes it extraordinarily difficult because your skin is at its thinnest when you're aged 18, 19, 20. When you are an undergraduate, that's when this stuff is like super thin. And you are bound to be really terrified of being called that kind of stuff online and seeing it retweeted and reposted and liked. I can barely imagine how I would have coped if that stuff had been done to me when I was 19. What can we do? Well, I learned a while back never to read the comments after the articles that I published. So if you write a newspaper article, there's a comment section. Never read that. It turns out that about 5% of readers write 98% of the comments, and they're all crazy. And so if you start reading the comments, your self-esteem will collapse. You'll never write another piece. So stop reading the comments. And the same applies here. Although your skin is thin, you need to say to yourself, these are empty words, and a significant percentage of that online antipathy is not human activity at all. I discovered, and I haven't revealed this to the world, but I'll do it now.
Please go ahead.
That 38% of my Twitter followers are in fact bots. It's kind of crushing. Only 9% of my wife's are bots. I have way more Russian interest in what I write than she does. So it's important to realize that social media are not really social, and that the people who are liking and disliking you are not necessarily people. And in the end, you need to somewhat screen out this abuse and recognize that it is just the latest form of psychological warfare that is intended to shut you up. Now, it's not the Cultural Revolution. It's not as bad as it was on the campuses in China in the late 1960s, so let's not get panic-stricken. But I think we all need, collectively, to be more skeptical about social media and thicker-skinned when we come under attack. I don't think we should fight fire with fire. Let me explain why. There was a time when I would fight back on Twitter, and it was particularly strongly incentivized when my wife was under attack. When she published her most recent book, Heretic, Why Islam Needs a Reformation Now, the attacks were relentless, and they came from some particularly odious characters in cyberspace. And I responded to every single one. I was like the guy in the pub in Glasgow who's just like, come on then, come on. And I would spend days rebutting Glenn Greenwald's scuzzy tweets. And then I realized this was exactly what they wanted me to do. My retaliation was like fuel on their fire. So in some ways, I think we have to step out of this jungle and simply decline to fight this kind of a war. We mustn't allow ourselves to be dragged down to the level of the Russian bots and their human imitators. We really must pull back, put those devices to one side, and pick up books. My great fear for your generation is that you are so drawn into this world of social media that you scarcely have any time to read the great works that my wife read at Leiden and I read at Oxford. I would just consciously reduce the amount of time that you spend online on social media. Reduce it until finally you cut it out of your life altogether. That would be my advice to you.
And that's an advice I think all professors at this university would agree on. So let's go to the maybe last question because we are running out of time.
Good afternoon, my name is Laura and I study journalism. I wanted to ask you a hypothetical question. Considering your wife was someone who actually experienced the transition between two completely different cultures, do you think that studying authors like David Hume would actually make a difference in Africa's culture in the long term?
Yes, I think it would. And in the same way, I think we have a responsibility to read about the experience of African intellectuals. And indeed, my wife's autobiography, the first volume of which is called Infidel, is just a wonderful insight into what it was like to be her as a little girl. There's a wonderful example of what can be achieved in Somalia today. There's a school called Abaso in Somaliland, which was set up by an amazing man who decided, he'd made a bit of money on Wall Street, and he decided, I'm going to do some good. I'm going to go and I'm going to create a school in Somalia that gives some Somali kids a chance at a good education and exposes them to science, as well as liberal arts. And so Jonathan Starr, that's his name, some 6 or 7 years ago, started a school in the least promising country you could choose. The failed state of failed states. And his proposition was a simple one. I offer you, parents, a chance for your kids that is way better than the madrasa over there that the Saudis built. Now, this story is a really heartwarming one because it's been a huge success. And graduates from this school have been going to colleges in the United States, including Harvard, in recent years. He has shown that it can be done even in the least promising of settings. You're a journalist, student of journalism, and you'll appreciate the importance of getting the right publicity around a story like that. So we helped get him on 60 Minutes. Anderson Cooper went to the school, filmed Jonathan with the kids there, and he's now published a book with the title, It Takes a School. And my conclusion is a relatively simple one. Most of the world's problems are in fact related to education. Bad education leads to bad outcomes. It's usually too late by the time people get to your age. The damage has already been done if it's been done. And the state, the governments in most countries are incapable of providing decent schools. And what we need to do is what Jonathan Starr did. Create new schools and new colleges, take money and invest it in that kind of philanthropy. It's incredibly cheap to build a school in Somalia. He's like, you won't believe how cheap this was. He took no aid money, no government money. He did it on his own dime. It's a wonderful story, and it's also proof that apparently insoluble problems are in fact quite simple to solve. Guess what? Good education works. Somalis plus science solves the extremism problem in 1 generation. The challenge is to scale it. If you build 1,000 schools like that, you start to change the world. He's now building a teacher training college in the hope that graduates of the school can then become teachers. That's the kind of philanthropy that I'm excited about. And in my view, it proves that we can, in fact, address many of what seem to be the most intractable problems, and it doesn't even need to bankrupt us. Is there time for one more question, Axel, or should we call
There
it?
is time for one more.
I'll give a really short answer.
The last question. There is one there, and we have so many.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Matías y me surgió una duda respecto a una entrevista que hubo hace un par de días en la universidad, donde sostuvo que las apps que describen civilización, ¿cierto? La más determinante dentro de la historia del Occidente es la revolución científica y que posteriormente fuera el pueblo. ¿Por qué considera que la sociedad de consumo fue más importante y determinante para la constitución ¿cierto? Por sobre otra de las que eran sobre la competencia y la democracia? Y por otro lado, ¿cree que esta app tuvo alguna repercusión en la libertad de expresión que sostiene que tenemos en comparación al contexto que expresó su esposa?
Well, a man is not under oath when being interviewed, and so I'll put it like this. The book really argues, this is the book Civilization, that there are 6 institutions and ideas that explain Western success, and one of them is science. But it's only one of the 6, and it's not the first one in the book. The first one is actually competition, the idea of economic and political competition. Which came first in any case. Then there's the rule of law based on private property rights, science, but also modern medicine, and then the consumer society, without which there's no point having an industrial revolution, and finally the work ethic, which has kept you all here until quite late in the school day, I assume. So in practice, these are all equally important in the argument of the book. And I argue that it's quite hard to have just some of them. China is trying to have some, but not all of the killer apps. It doesn't want political competition. It definitely doesn't want the rule of law based on private property rights. And I think that ultimately means that the Xi Jinping vision will fail, despite the current sycophancy that he is enjoying from many Western commentators. My joke about alcohol is a joke. And I'm going to end on a light-hearted note, because this is a pretty serious subject. But you know what? The thing that I hate the most about political correctness is that it has made it so difficult to be funny.
Right.
All the things that I used to make jokes about when I was a kid are now banned. You cannot make jokes about any of the things that I used to think were funny. And that's a pity, because humor is actually designed by evolution to deal with problematic subjects. That's how we used to deal with sensitive subjects like race or class or gender. All those things that you're no longer allowed to make jokes about, we used to make jokes about. And I think it's a great shame that it's become so hard to make a joke in the press or in an interview without somebody taking you literally. Of course, there isn't a seventh killer app called alcohol. It's nevertheless true that of all the contributions that Western civilization has made to human happiness, our refinement of the ways in which you can consume alcohol definitely deserves wider recognition. And I'm sure in a wine-producing country such as Chile, few people will disagree with me on that, nor have experiments with the prohibition of alcohol consumption been a huge success in human history, which kind of brings me back to my wife and her reasons for ceasing to be a Muslim. If I had a glass of wine, and I don't, I would raise it to her, and her readiness to break free from what were genuine killer apps, killer applications of Sharia law, and to embrace Western freedom, including the freedom to drink a glass of wine. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed.